Welcome to the Olive Grove podcast, everybody. We're going to be doing a deep dive on Isaiah chapter 24.
Oh, wow.
And this is a chapter that talks about the Great Tribulation and really doesn't pull any punches when it comes to judgment.
Right.
And we're going to be using a study from the My Christian Space website for this deep dive. It's called MCS Isaiah chapter 24.
Okay.
But, it's interesting because this chapter isn't all just fire and brimstone and doom and gloom. There's also some hints as to why this judgment occurs and also who might be spared from it.
Well, and what I think is really fascinating is that Isaiah in chapter 24 takes a much wider view than he did in the previous chapters. Before this, he's focused on pronouncements against specific nations like Babylon or Philistia.
Right.
But in this chapter, he's looking at the whole world. He's talking about a universal judgment that will affect everyone.
So it's not just like, nations that are facing the consequences, but individuals as well.
Exactly. It's not just about geopolitical powers, but about every single person.
So that's intense. That's pretty intense.
Yeah, it is.
It kind of makes you wonder, what could possibly lead to such a widespread judgment?
Yeah, and that's where the idea of the everlasting covenant comes into play. The study explains that this covenant is God's agreement for eternal life through accepting Yeshua or Jesus as the Messiah.
Right.
Breaking this covenant by rejecting this path is presented as the basis for this final judgment.
So basically turning away from that path to eternal life sets the stage for everything that Isaiah describes in chapter 24. Like it's a turning point for humanity.
That's exactly right. It's a pivotal moment. And, to really drive home the weight of this judgment, Isaiah uses some incredibly vivid imagery. He paints this picture of a fading, withering earth, a world that's literally languishing under the weight of sin.
Right.
Wilting vines, failing wine celebrations, being silenced. It all points to a world that's starved of joy and abundance.
It's like that withering earth is a reflection of humanity's spiritual state.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a physical manifestation of rejecting the everlasting covenant. The study connects this imagery back to the curse in Genesis, after Adam and Eve sinned,
Right.
suggesting that humanity's continued transgressions, particularly rejecting the everlasting covenant, they lead to this final judgment and the decaying world we see in Isaiah's prophecy.
So it's like the opposite of the flourishing, fruitful world that we often associate with God's blessings.
Right. It's a stark contrast.
Yeah, and speaking of stark contrast, there's this really jarring image of Jerusalem, God's chosen city, becoming worthless.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
What does that even mean? Like, how can the city of God become worthless?
Well, it's interesting. The source suggests that Jerusalem becoming worthless is connected to the idea of the rapture.
Right.
The belief that believers in Yeshua will be suddenly taken away from the earth before the tribulation.
So basically, the city loses its worth because the people who represent its true value, the believers, they're no longer there.
Exactly. It's like the city becomes an empty shell because its heart has been removed.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering thought.
It is. But even in this scenario, Isaiah doesn't leave us completely without hope, right? He mentions a remnant,
Yes, he does.
a group of believers who remain. Like, who are they?
Well, that's a question that a lot of scholars have debated. Some believe they could be the 144,000 mentioned in Revelation 7, a group that is sealed and protected during the tribulation. Isaiah compares them to olive gleanings.
Olive gleanings. Why olives?
Well, throughout the Bible, olives and olive trees symbolize righteousness, especially righteousness achieved through faith in Yeshua.
Right.
So these gleanings, the leftover olives, represent those who have remained faithful, even when surrounded by widespread rejection of Yeshua.
So even when it seems like the whole world is turning away, there's this small group who stay true to their faith.
Yeah, like the last fruits clinging to a withering branch.
Wow. And they don't just survive. They actually have a specific role to play during this time of judgment, right?
Exactly. And their response stands in stark contrast to how the rest of the world is reacting. While many are desperately seeking escape through things like alcohol and drugs.
Which honestly feels a little too real given what we see happening in the world today.
Right. The desire to numb ourselves to difficult realities, it's something a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, for sure.
But amidst this despair, the remnant stands apart. They're singing praises to God, sustained by his provision, much like Elijah was during the famine. Their faith becomes a source of strength and resilience in the face of this overwhelming darkness.
That's a powerful image. This small group voices rising in praise while the world around them crumbles.
It is.
It speaks to the enduring nature of true faith, even in the darkest of times.
Yeah, it really does.
And it seems like this unwavering faith is what prepares them for the final battle that Isaiah describes.
Right.
He talks about worldly armies gathering against Jerusalem, which reminds me of Revelation 19, where Yeshua leads heavenly armies against Satan and his followers.
It's this epic cosmic showdown. And the outcome, as described in both Isaiah and Revelation, is the defeat and imprisonment of Satan, followed by Yeshua's 1,000-year rule from Jerusalem, a period known as the millennial reign.
So after all the tribulation and judgment, there's this promise of a renewed world under Yeshua's righteous rule.
Exactly.
It's kind of hard to imagine after everything that comes before it.
It is. It's a vision of hope that emerges from the darkness, a world transformed and restored. But to understand the full impact of that transformation, we need to dig a little deeper into what that millennial reign actually entails.
Right.
What it will look like and what it will mean for humanity.
Okay, so let's dive in.
So when we talk about this judgment, it's not just Satan who's facing the consequences. Isaiah also talks about the punishment of the hosts of the high ones that are on high.
The hosts of the high ones, who are they?
Well, it's a bit of a mysterious phrase, but some scholars believe it could refer to fallen angels or demonic forces that are allied with Satan.
So it adds another layer to this cosmic battle, right?
Exactly. It's not just earthly powers clashing. It's a spiritual war playing out on a grand scale.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely. The source we're looking at connects this passage in Isaiah to the events described in Revelation 19,
Right.
where Yeshua leads the armies of heaven against these forces of darkness.
Wow. It's hard to even fathom a battle of that magnitude, angels and demons and armies clashing.
It's like something out of a fantasy epic, but with internal consequences.
But ultimately, righteousness prevails,
Yeah.
right? Satan and his allies are defeated and imprisoned.
Exactly. And that's when we enter this period of peace and restoration that's known as the millennial reign.
That 1,000 years of Yeshua ruling from Jerusalem, it's almost like hitting the reset button on humanity after all the darkness and turmoil.
It is. It's a beautiful image of renewal and hope.
But it's interesting how Isaiah describes this transition.
How so?
He talks about the moon being confounded and the sun being ashamed.
Right?
It's as if the very cosmos is acknowledging the shift in power and authority.
It's like the universe itself is realigning under Yeshua's rule. And the source points out that this millennial reign isn't just about establishing order and peace.
Right.
Isaiah emphasizes that Yeshua's glory will be manifested unto all the princes of his people.
So it's not just about power, but about revelation.
Exactly. The true glory of God is finally being revealed to those who have chosen to follow him.
It makes you think about the choices we make in our lives today.
Yeah, it really does.
The decisions we make to embrace or reject this path to eternal life, they have consequences that extend far beyond our earthly existence.
That's a theme that Isaiah 24 lays out very clearly.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just living for this moment, for the here and now. Our actions have implications that ripple through eternity.
Absolutely.
And that brings us back to the everlasting covenant. This idea that accepting Yeshua as the Messiah is the key to not just avoiding judgment, but participating in the blessings of this millennial reign.
It's a choice we all have to make. Do we align ourselves with God's will and embrace his offer of salvation? Or do we go our own way and face the consequences of that decision?
And Isaiah 24 doesn't shy away from the weight of that choice.
No, it doesn't.
It's a call to seriously examine our hearts and consider where we stand.
Right.
But amidst this sobering reality, there's also this incredible vision of hope. This picture of a world transformed under Yeshua's rule, a world where peace and justice prevail.
It's a powerful image to hold on to, especially when the world around us feels chaotic and uncertain.
It really is. And it makes you wonder what that world might look like, how our lives might be different if we fully embrace the principles of this everlasting covenant, not just as a theological concept, but as a way of life.
That's a great question to ponder.
Yeah, it really makes you stop and think, Judgment, covenant, tribulation, hope. Isaiah 24 covers a lot of ground.
It does. And it leaves us with a lot to ponder.
It does.
What strikes me is how it goes beyond just laying out a timeline of future events. It really grapples with these big questions about human choices and the nature of God's justice, and ultimately the triumph of good over evil.
It's presented in such a vivid, almost poetic way.
It is.
It's not just a dry theological lecture. It's an invitation to really look inward and examine our own hearts.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so relevant even thousands of years later.
Right.
These themes of judgment and hope and the importance of choosing our path, they resonate so deeply with the human experience no matter what time period we're living in.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Isaiah 24, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will walk away with?
Well, I think the biggest one is this idea that our choices have eternal consequences.
Right.
Isaiah doesn't sugarcoat it. Rejecting God's offer of salvation through Yeshua has lasting implications.
But on the flip side, embracing that covenant offers incredible hope.
It does.
That imagery of the millennial reign, a world transformed, a time of peace and restoration.
Right.
It's a powerful vision to hold on to, especially when the world feels so chaotic and uncertain.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of darkness, there's always light.
Yeah.
There's always a promise of a future where righteousness prevails.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to really reflect on what we've explored today.
Yeah, think about it.
What does the everlasting covenant mean to you personally?
Right.
How would you respond if faced with the kind of global upheaval that Isaiah describes?
Those are questions worth wrestling with.
Yeah, they are. And remember, even in the darkest of times, hope remains.
It does.
Hope rooted in the faithfulness of God and the promise of a world made new.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Isaiah 24. Be sure to subscribe to the Olive Grove podcast on YouTube. And for early access to new episodes, visit the My Christian Space website. Until next time, may you find peace and purpose in your journey of faith.